The teacher turned on the bullies, his anger rising, his words sharp. But before he could finish, the blind girl lifted her hand slightly, stopping him. She said in that same calm voice that punishment was not hers to demand, that the shame of what they had done was already enough. Her words shocked the crowd. Even the teacher paused because her strength was not only in her strikes, but in her mercy. She had faced cruelty. She had answered with power, and still she carried herself. With dignity, the bullies lowered their heads, their faces burning. Unable to meet her gaze, though her eyes did not see them, the crowd leaned closer, some whispering that they would never forget this. Others realizing that the lesson was not just for the bullies, but for all of them. Never to mistake silence for weakness. Never to mistake blindness for helplessness. The leader finally collapsed onto a bench, his pride completely broken, his friends slinking away into the crowd, trying to disappear from the weight of so many eyes. The blind girl bent slowly, gathering, her books one by one, her movements precise, unhurried, each gesture filled with a quiet grace that made the crowd part around her, giving her space, not out of pity, but out of respect. As she stood and placed the last book into her bag, the students around her fell into silence again, watching as she tapped her cane once more against the floor, each tap now carrying meaning, strength, and warning. She walked away calmly, the crowd opening for her like a path of honor. No one dared block her way. No one dared speak until she was gone. And when she disappeared into the halls of the academy, the whispers rose again, not of cruelty, but of awe. They called her a fighter, a warrior, a black belt who had been among them all along, unseen, underestimated, until she chose to reveal the truth. That day became more than just a fight in a courtyard. It became a story that spread through the academy, whispered in classrooms, shared in training halls, retold in the dormitories. The lesson carved deep into the hearts of every student who had seen it with their own eyes. The blind girl who had been mocked, humiliated, and surrounded had revealed her strength with patience, precision, and courage. And though she never raised her voice, she had silenced an entire crowd, proving to all of them that true power does not always roar. It sometimes walks quietly, taps softly, and waits for the right moment to strike. The sun dipped low beyond the academy's glass towers, painting the courtyard in long shadows, but the echoes of what had happened there still clung to every stone. Students lingered in small groups, their voices hushed, their eyes wide. They spoke not of lessons or exams, but of the blind black girl, who had stood alone against her tormentors, who had turned mockery into silence and humiliation into respect. Her name whispered like something new, no longer tied to pity but to awe. The bullies who had once laughed at her slunk away in shame, their heads bowed, their pride shattered, each step they took only deepening the memory of their defeat. And though they tried to disappear into the crowd, their shame followed them like a shadow that could never be shaken off. The leader, once loudest of them all, limped through the halls clutching his ribs, his face pale, his silence louder than his insults had ever been. He had wanted to prove her weak, but it was his arrogance that lay broken before the entire academy. The blind girl, meanwhile, walked with her cane tapping gently, her steps slow and steady, her books gathered in her bag once more. She made no announcement, no grand gesture. She simply moved with the same quiet dignity she always carried. But now every tap of her cane made heads turn. Every step pulled eyes toward her. The students who had once ignored her now parted to give her space, not out of pity, but out of reverence. Whispers followed her down every corridor, some calling her brave, others calling her dangerous, yet all of them agreeing on one thing. She was not to be underestimated again. She had shown them all that blindness did not mean weakness, that silence was not surrender, that dignity was sharper than cruelty, and that true strength lived beneath the surface, unseen, until it was forced to rise. That night in the dormitories, the story spread further, retold again and again. Some students added details, saying she had moved faster than the eye could follow. Others swore she had heard every step before it landed. Still others whispered that she could sense fear itself. The tale grew with each telling, but the heart of it never changed. The lesson remained. She had warned them. She had given them chances to stop, and when they refused, she revealed the truth of who she was. A fighter trained, a black belt hidden in plain sight, and the humiliation of the bullies became the Academy's greatest reminder that cruelty often masks fear and arrogance often hides weakness. In the days that followed, the atmosphere of the Academy shifted. The bullies who had once held sway, through laughter and cruelty, now walked quietly. Their voices muted, their gazes lowered, no longer feared, no longer admired. And the blind girl, though she sought no fame, carried herself as she always had, calm, composed, unshaken. But those around her changed. Students who had once mocked or pitied now offered her space, respect, even quiet nods of acknowledgement. Teachers spoke of discipline and patience with new meaning, using her as an unspoken example. And the Academy itself seemed to hum with a new awareness. The truth of strength had been rewritten, not in the training halls, not in competitions, but in a single courtyard where silence had defeated arrogance. One evening, as she walked alone, with her cane tapping softly against the stone, a small group of younger students approached her, their voices hesitant, their faces nervous. They thanked her quietly, not for the fight, but for showing them that they too could stand tall even when the world tried to press them down. She listened, her calm face softening, and though she said little, her quiet nod was enough. Her presence itself had become an answer. The courtyard fight had ended, but its impact lived on, woven into the Academy's story, whispered into its walls. A reminder to every student who passed through its gates that sight is not the only vision, that silence is not weakness, and that hidden strength is the sharpest weapon of all. And so the legend of the blind black girl grew, not because she shouted her triumph, but because she never needed to. Her patience, her control, her calm strength spoke louder than any boast. The bullies had tried to humiliate her, to strip her dignity, but it was they who walked away broken, their pride shattered. Before hundreds of watching eyes, she had shown them, and the entire Academy, that respect cannot be taken by force. It is commanded by truth, and her truth was now etched forever in their memory, long after the laughter had died, long after the whispers turned to silence. The story would remain of a blind girl mocked by bullies, and the moment they froze when her hidden power finally revealed itself. He circled her again, his voice louder now, shouting insults to hide his fear. He said she was nothing, that she was weak, that he would prove it to everyone. His fists rose, ready to strike. The crowd's whispers turned to silence, waiting. The girl's cane tapped once against the floor. Her grip firm, her body steady. She tilted her head slightly toward him, her lips parting as she spoke, her voice calm but sharp. She told him again that this was his last chance to stop. Her words carried such weight that even the onlookers shivered, but the leader's pride drowned out reason. He roared and lunged at her, swinging his fist. The crowd gasped in unison. Time seemed to slow as everyone expected her to fall. But she moved faster than sight, stepping aside with precision, her cane rising in a blur, striking his ribs with a crack that echoed. His body jerked as pain spread through him, his knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, clutching his side. The courtyard exploded with noise, some gasping, some cheering, all staring in disbelief. The blind girl lowered her cane again, her stance calm, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. While the leader groaned on the ground, the rest of the bullies frozen in place, their courage broken, their arrogance shattered. They had mocked her blindness, thinking it weakness. But now the truth stood before them, undeniable. She was not only strong, She was trained, disciplined, and far beyond their reach. The crowd erupted in whispers that carried like fire, students repeating over and over that she was a black belt, that she had been trained all along. The bullies glanced at the sea of eyes watching them, their humiliation complete. The leader tried to rise, but his legs shook, his pride bleeding out with every gasp. The blind girl said nothing more, her silence louder than any words. And in that silence, the lesson was carved deep into every heart. She was not helpless. She was unstoppable. And from that moment forward, the bullies would never forget the day their cruelty was answered with strength they could not see coming. The courtyard had shifted from a stage of mockery to an arena of awe. The bullies who once strutted with pride now stood pale and shaken, clutching sore ribs and bruised arms, while the blind black girl remained at the center, her cane resting firmly in her hand. Her face calm, her breathing steady, the crowd pressed closer, their whispers buzzing like electricity in the air. No one had expected this. No one had imagined that the girl they once pitied or mocked would move with such power. Yet here she stood, unbroken, her presence heavier than all their laughter combined. The leader, still bent over and groaning from the strike to his ribs, tried to push himself upright, his pride refusing to let him stay down. He glared at her through the haze of pain, his jaw tight, his voice hoarse as he shouted that the fight wasn't over, that she had only embarrassed him, not beaten him. His words trembled with desperation, but he shouted louder, trying to save face in front of the crowd. The blind girl tilted her head slightly, her unseeing eyes turning toward him, her lips parting as she spoke again, her voice steady, quiet. But carrying across the courtyard like iron, she told him to stay down, that he had already lost. Her words struck deeper than any cane, because they carried the weight of truth. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others whispering that she was right, that he had no chance. But arrogance is a fire that burns even in the ashes of defeat. The leader clenched his fists and staggered. Forward, his steps uneven but determined, his friends hesitated, looking at him nervously. Torn between loyalty and fear, one muttered that it was enough, that they should leave, but the leader snarled at them to follow, his pride commanding them more than reason, and though their legs shook, two stepped closer, circling her again. The blind girl shifted her stance, the cane tapping once against the ground, sharp and final, her body relaxed but ready, her ears tuned to every breath, every shuffle, every tremor in the air. The first bully lunged, his arm swinging wildly, but she moved with ease, tilting her body just enough for the strike to pass. Her cane snapping upward in a clean arc that struck his shoulder, the crack of wood against bone echoing. He cried out, stumbling back, clutching the spot, his face twisted in shock. Before he could recover, another rushed from behind. But she pivoted smoothly, her cane whipping low across his shin, the impact sending him crashing to the ground, rolling onto his side in pain. The crowd erupted in cheers and gasps, their voices no longer mocking but filled with admiration. The whispers of "she's a black belt" spreading like fire, confirmed with every strike. The leader froze, his bravado draining as he watched his friends fall. His hands trembling though he clenched them into fists, he shouted again, more desperate now, saying she couldn't beat all of them, that she was still nothing compared to him. But even as he spoke, his voice cracked, the crowd no longer on his side, their eyes fixed on the girl with respect, with awe, and with fear of what she might still be holding back. The blind girl stood tall, her cane lowered once more, her chest steady, her silence pressing harder than his shouting. She spoke again, her voice cutting through the noise, telling him that arrogance blinds more than darkness. Her words silenced even the whispers. The leader's face turned red, fury and shame burning him alive, but his legs shook, his pride and his fear battling until his body betrayed him. He stumbled, unable to step forward. The courtyard went quiet again, every student watching, every breath held. The blind girl lifted her cane slightly, not to strike, but to rest it against the ground, her stance calm, unshaken. She had no need to attack further. She had already won. The bullies stood broken, humiliated, their arrogance shattered before the eyes of the academy. The leader finally lowered his head, his fists unclenching, his body sagging with defeat. The crowd's whispers rose again, this time filled with respect, some even cheering her name softly, others repeating that they would never forget this moment. The blind black girl turned slowly, gathering her scattered books once more, her movements calm, her silence heavier than any victory cry. The bullies could only watch, their pride crushed, their cruelty exposed, and the academy learned a truth that day, a truth carved into the stone of the courtyard itself. Blindness did not mean weakness, silence did not mean fear, and the girl they mocked had shown them a strength greater than sight, the strength of patience, of skill, of unshaken will. The courtyard felt transformed, no longer a place of cruelty, but a place of revelation. The bullies who had once strutted, with arrogant laughter, now stood on the edges of their own shame, their bodies aching, their faces pale, their pride crushed beneath the weight of what they had unleashed. At the center of it all stood the blind black girl, her cane resting firmly in her hand, her posture calm, her breathing steady, her unseeing eyes lifted toward the air as though she could see beyond them all. The crowd that had gathered was larger than before. Students pressed shoulder to shoulder, their whispers weaving into a wave of awe. Some of them leaned forward in respect, others hung back in guilt, remembering how they had once laughed with the bullies, yet none could deny the truth anymore. She was no victim, she was no weak shadow to be mocked. She was strength they had never expected, a quiet storm they had underestimated. The leader of the bullies stood trembling, clutching his ribs where her cane had struck, his eyes darting wildly, searching for a way to reclaim what he had lost. But every glance only showed him the crowd's disapproval, their whispers cutting deeper than her strikes. He shouted again, his voice breaking, demanding that no one believe she had won, insisting she had only caught them off guard. But his words rang hollow. No one listened. Even his friends stepped back, refusing to face her again, their arrogance drained away, leaving only shame. The girl did not answer him, her silence heavier than any insult. She stood rooted like a pillar, her cane tapping once against the ground, the sound sharp, steady, final. And in that moment, the crowd felt it too. She had no need to prove herself further. The battle was already decided. A teacher arrived then, his robe sweeping as he pushed through the circle of students, his voice sharp as he demanded to know. What had happened? The bullies stammered, their excuses tumbling out in broken words, claiming they were only joking, that they had not meant harm. But their bruises, their trembling voices, and the silence of the crowd told the real story. The teacher turned his gaze toward the blind girl, his expression softening as he took in the calm strength she radiated. He asked her if she was hurt, but she shook her head slowly, answering with quiet dignity that she was fine, that she needed no pity. Her voice was low, but it carried across the courtyard with the same weight that had silenced her tormentors. The crowd murmured again. This time not with disbelief but with respect. They had never heard a voice so calm, so certain, yet so unyielding. One of the smaller bullies reached out, grabbing at her shoulder, but the girl shifted slightly. Not away, but to stand firmer, her grip on the cane tightening. The bully laughed and tried again, this time brushing her arm as if daring her to react. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath, expecting her to stumble, but her face remained calm, her lips pressing into a faint line of patience that was running thin. Finally, she spoke again, her words low but sharp, telling them clearly, "Step back." The sound was so steady that it cut through the courtyard louder than the shouts of her tormentors. For a moment the bullies froze, surprised by the weight in her tone, their arrogance cracking just a little. Then the leader barked out a laugh to cover his unease, mocking her for giving orders she could never enforce. His words rolled into the air, but they did not feel as strong as before. The blind girl adjusted her stance, her feet sliding into place with a smoothness that most missed, but not all, Few in the crowd whispered to each other, noticing the way her posture had changed, no longer a fragile stance, but something trained, something deliberate. She lifted her cane slightly, just enough for the tip to hover above the ground, her head, tilting again toward the sound of the leader's boots as he stepped closer. She warned them a second time, her voice firmer now, colder, saying that if they did not stop, they would regret it. The crowd's whispers turned into gasps, because the tone in her voice did not sound like fear. It sounded like certainty, and certainty was more dangerous than threats. The bullies looked at each other, doubt flickering across their faces. But pride is a cruel master, and none of them wanted to step back in front of so many witnesses. The leader sneered and raised his hand as if to shove her again. Laughing that she could not stop him, the crowd tensed, every eye fixed on the space between his hand and her shoulder, the air heavy with expectation. The girl's cane tapped once against the ground, the sound sharp, final, a rhythm that seemed to echo longer than it should. And then her lips parted once more, her words quiet but unmistakable. "This is your last warning." The silence that followed was heavy. The crowd barely breathing, waiting. The bullies hesitated for just a heartbeat, but arrogance pushed them forward again. The leader lunged, his hand reaching, his laughter echoing, and the crowd gasped as they waited for what everyone assumed would be the blind girl's fall. Yet beneath her calm expression, beneath the stillness of her unseeing eyes, something fierce was ready to strike, something none of them were prepared to witness. The courtyard fell into a tense hush as the leader's hand moved toward her shoulder, his smirk wide, his confidence overflowing. He believed the moment belonged to him, that the blind girl could do nothing but stand there and take his mockery. Yet beneath her calm face and unseeing eyes, her body was already alive with movement no one else could sense. Her ears picked up the faint scrape of his boots, the shift in air as his arm stretched closer, the sharp intake of breath from the crowd as they leaned in, waiting for humiliation. And then it happened, faster than anyone could understand. Her cane snapped upward, not wild or clumsy, but precise, the wooden tip striking cleanly against his wrist, the sound of impact sharp. His laugh cut short as he yelped in pain, stumbling back, clutching his arm. The crowd gasped, their voices rising in shock. The silence shattered not by laughter, but by disbelief. The bullies froze, their arrogance cracking, eyes wide as they stared at the blind girl who stood unmoved, her cane steady, her breathing calm. The leader snarled, trying to recover, spitting insults to mask his pain. But the crowd had seen it. They had seen how fast she moved, how sharp her strike had been, too sharp for chance. One of the other bullies stepped forward, growling that it was luck, that she could not do it again. He lunged, reaching for her shoulder, but she pivoted, her body turning smoothly, the cane sliding low, sweeping across his legs. His feet flew out from under him, and he crashed to the ground, his back hitting hard. The onlookers gasped louder, some even cheering quietly, their whispers running wild. It was no accident. She was trained, every move controlled, every strike exact. The remaining bullies exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence shaken but their pride refusing to let them back down. Two rushed her at once, one from the front, the other from the side. The crowd shouted warnings, expecting her to be overwhelmed, but the girl listened. Every step, every breath around her painting the scene in her mind. She shifted just as the first lunged, her cane thrust forward, striking him in the stomach with a force that sent him stumbling back, gasping for air. Then she spun, her cane whipping sideways, striking the second across the ribs. The crack of impact echoing through the courtyard. He stumbled too, clutching his side. Their arrogance now shattered, their laughter silenced completely, replaced by groans and the sound of the crowd erupting in disbelief. The blind girl lowered her cane again, standing tall, her face still calm, her unseeing eyes lifted toward the group of bullies who now stood trembling, their mouths open but no insult spilling out. The crowd was no longer mocking, no longer whispering with cruelty. They were in awe. The truth was clear in every mind. She was not helpless. She was not weak. She had been trained. Her silence had not been fear. It had been patience. Her warnings were not empty. They were promises, and now those promises had been kept. The leader tried to step forward again, his voice cracking as he shouted that it was not over, that she would pay. But his body betrayed him. His legs stiff, his wrist aching, his pride shattered in front of everyone. The courtyard roared with whispers, some students cheering her bravery, others stunned into silence. No one dared mock her. Now, she stood at the center like a pillar, calm, unshaken, her cane tapping once more against the floor, the sound no longer mistaken for weakness but recognized as power. The bullies, pale and shaken, stepped back slowly, their eyes darting between her and the crowd. Realizing the balance had shifted completely, the blind black girl who they thought was helpless had turned their cruelty against them, exposing their weakness for all to see. And though the fight was not yet over, everyone present understood one truth. The bullies had awakened something far stronger than their arrogance, and they were no longer in control. The courtyard was alive with whispers now, not of mockery, but of awe. The crowd that had gathered leaned forward, their eyes wide, their voices trembling with disbelief. The bullies who once stood tall and arrogant were shaken, clutching bruises and glancing nervously at one another. Their laughter gone, replaced with the fear of being exposed. In front of everyone, the blind black girl stood at the center, her cane resting lightly against the floor, her chest rising and falling with calm. Her face steady, her unseeing eyes lifted toward them as if she could still see their shame. The leader of the group growled under his breath, his pride too wounded to retreat. He wiped sweat from his brow and spat on the ground, declaring loudly that it was still a fluke, that she had just been lucky. His voice trying to cover the cracks in his courage, but the crowd was not convinced. They had seen the way she moved, the precision in her strikes. No accident could have been repeated so flawlessly. Murmurs of, "She's trained," rippled through the students, and the bullies felt the weight of those whispers pressing on them. The leader gestured for two of his friends to attack at once, desperate to regain control. They rushed forward together, their steps heavy, their breaths sharp. The blind girl shifted her stance, her head tilting slightly as she listened, the sound of their boots scraping against stone, the rush of their breath, the faint whistle of air as one swung his arm. Her cane snapped upward with perfect timing, striking the first in the chest so hard he stumbled back into the circle of onlookers, gasping for air. The second tried to grab her arm, but she twisted, her cane sliding low and fast, sweeping his legs from under him. He hit the ground with a thud that echoed in the silence. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs, some even clapping quietly, unable to contain their amazement. The leader's jaw dropped, his confidence draining with every second, but his pride forced him to step forward. His hands clenched into fists, his face twisted with anger. The academy was vast, its towers of glass and steel stretching high under the alien sun, halls buzzing with voices of many species. Young minds from across the galaxy gathered here to train, to learn, and to prove themselves. Yet in that bright and crowded place, one figure moved slowly and quietly. A blind black girl with her cane tapping softly against the smooth floor. She carried her bag on one shoulder, her head lifted, her steps steady, though her eyes could not see. She walked. With a calm that unsettled some and annoyed others, she was different. And in the academy different was often mistaken for weak. A group of students noticed her as she passed, their laughter sharp, their words cruel. Some were human, some alien, but all of them shared the same smugness. One pointed at her cane and whispered loudly that she was useless. Another said she was only here out of pity. A token student in a place built for the strong. The girl did not respond. Her cane tapped steadily, each sound echoing in the long corridor. But their voices followed her like claws. The bullies quickened their steps, circling around her as if she were prey. One alien boy with scaled skin sneered that she would never pass the combat exams, that she should stay in the dorms where she belonged. Another human laughed that she was broken, too fragile to even defend herself. They mocked her blindness, waving their hands close to her face, knowing she could not see them, their voices rising with cruel excitement, as if each insult gave them power. The girl stopped, tilting her head slightly, her lips pressed together, her hand resting lightly on the cane. She heard everything, every step, every whisper, every mocking laugh, and though her eyes could not show it, her ears painted a picture sharper than sight. Still, she said nothing, her silence only feeding their arrogance. Other students began to notice the scene, slowing their pace, gathering in small groups along the edges of the hall. Some watched with discomfort, others with curiosity. Whispers spread quickly. Many believed the bullies would push her too far, but few expected her to fight back. She looked fragile. She looked helpless. And in a place where strength was measured by show and pride, she appeared to have neither. One bully shoved her shoulder, testing her balance. Her cane tapped twice. On the floor, as she steadied herself, the shove was small, but the laughter it caused was loud. Echoing down the corridor, another bully kicked lightly at her bag, making it slide down her shoulder. She reached up calmly and fixed it, her hand moving with quiet patience, but her silence only encouraged them further. They wanted a reaction. They wanted fear, but she gave them none. The lead bully, taller than the rest, stepped closer, his voice dripping with mockery. He asked if she even knew where she was, if she could see the shame of being so helpless. The words rolled out like poison, feeding the crowd that was now gathering in a full circle around her. Still, the girl did not flinch, her breathing calm, her head slightly tilted. Listening, her cane tapped again. A small sound, almost lost in the noise, but sharp enough to draw a brief hush. For a moment, the bullies paused, as if sensing something, then laughed again, louder. Trying to cover the sudden unease, she shifted her stance, her free hand brushing lightly against her side, the motion so subtle no one paid attention. Her calm presence was mistaken again for weakness, and the bullies pressed closer, their laughter echoing in the high walls of the academy. The whispers in the crowd grew, some saying she would break, others saying she would cry, and a few, their voices quiet, wondering if maybe she was not as helpless as she looked. But the bullies only saw what they wanted, a blind girl alone, surrounded, their power stronger in numbers, yet as they closed in, the calm on her face did not change. Her silence was heavier than their noise, and though none of them understood it yet, that silence carried more weight than their laughter ever could. The cane tapped once more against the floor, and the sound seemed to echo longer this time, a steady beat, a warning no one recognized. The crowd leaned forward, the bullies grinned wider, believing they had already won. But the girl's stillness was not fear, it was patience. And in that moment, though, no one knew it. The balance of power was already shifting. The bullies tightened their circle, their voices rising as if the noise itself would break her calm. One human boy leaned close, whispering insults about her blindness. Another alien with ridged skin hissed that she should crawl instead of walk. Their laughter burst like firecrackers, sharp and mocking, echoing against the academy walls. Yet the blind black girl remained still, her cane resting lightly against the floor, her head tilted ever so slightly as if she were listening not to their voices but to the rhythm of their breaths, the shuffle of their shoes, the nervous energy humming beneath their cruelty. To everyone watching it looked as if she was frozen in fear. But inside her mind, she was mapping every sound, painting the space around her with invisible lines. No one else could see. One of the bullies reached out and shoved her again, harder this time, trying to make her stumble. The cane tapped sharply and her foot shifted just enough to hold her balance. The crowd gasped softly, expecting her to fall, but she did not. She stood tall, her silence as unshaken as before. Another bully kicked at her cane, knocking it sideways. But in one swift motion, she caught it before it fell, her hand steady, her grip firm, her head lifting slightly toward the sound of the kick. The bullies laughed louder, not noticing how her stance had shifted, no longer loose and casual but grounded, her feet planted with a quiet strength. The whispers from the crowd grew, some students uneasy, some eager, waiting for something to happen. Because though she had not spoken, her presence had begun to change. The air felt heavier, the laughter forced. The tallest bully leaned in close, waving his hand in front of her face, his voice dripping with mockery as he asked if she could see him now, if she even knew who she was talking to. But before she could answer, another shoved her bag off her shoulder, the book scattering across the floor, pages fluttering as they slid under the boots of the circle. The crowd gasped again, this time louder, some stepping back, others whispering that the bullies had gone too far. But the girl simply lowered herself, feeling the ground with one hand, calmly gathering her things, her movements precise, unhurried, her silence a sharper response than any words could be. The bullies smirked at what they thought was submission, but those who watched closely noticed the way her fingers flexed around the cane as she stood again, her shoulders straightening, her face still calm, but her body speaking something different, something waiting. One of the aliens stepped forward boldly, his scaled hands reaching for her arm as if to pull her off balance. The crowd leaned forward, in breathless silence, expecting to see her stumble at last, but instead she shifted her head slightly, her lips parting, and for the first time she spoke, her voice low, steady, almost quiet enough to be missed, yet every ear caught it. She told them to stop, her words not a plea but a warning, a calmness that cut through their laughter like a blade through silk. For a moment the bullies paused, startled by the weight in her tone. The crowd stilled as well, a faint hush falling over the circle, but arrogance is stubborn and silence makes it itch. The bullies laughed again, louder now, trying to bury the unease her words had planted. The leader sneered that she had no power, that a blind girl could never fight back. His laughter echoed, but it did not feel as strong as before. The girl tilted her head again, the cane tapping softly against the floor. Once, twice, the sound sharp and steady. It was such a small action, yet it carried a tension that made the crowd hold its breath. She lifted her chin, her unseeing eyes focused on the leader, though she could not see him. And in that moment the silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on the group like an invisible weight. Some in the crowd whispered that she was fearless. Others whispered that she was foolish. But all of them could feel it now. The balance was shifting. Her warning had been given. Her silence sharpened into something more. And though the bullies could not see it, the watchers began to understand. The blind black girl was not helpless. She was waiting. And the moment they stepped further, the truth would break free. The crowd around the courtyard had grown thicker, drawn in by whispers that something unusual was happening, but the bullies were too caught up in their own arrogance to notice how many eyes were now on them. The blind black girl stood in the center with her cane resting lightly against the ground, her breathing steady, her head tilted as though she were listening to the air itself. The tallest bully smirked and circled her slowly, his boots scraping against the stone floor, the sound sharp and clear to her ears. He taunted her again, asking if she could hear his footsteps, mocking that she would never know where the next shove would come from. The crowd chuckled nervously, though their laughter carried more unease than joy, because something in the girl's stillness unsettled them. She had not moved in panic, had not begged or cried. Instead, she seemed to be waiting, her silence more powerful than their noise.